Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting installment of our Slate demo series. Today, we're going to be talking about Consolidate Records. It's a large topic, so I'll keep my intro brief. My name is Nick Porcella. I am our Assistant Director of Slate Trainings, and my Carnegie persona is the industrious and meticulous philosopher. Now, this agenda is deceptively short. It's actually a pretty large topic. We're going to start with an overview to identify what this module is. And then we'll dive right into Slate. We'll actually go look at the module itself, and we'll take a look at how we would use this tool on a daily basis. And then we'll end with a summary of best practices where we'll encapsulate and summarize everything we're taking away from today. Now, do keep in mind that when I offer this training, typically it's a 60 or 90-minute session. So just keep that in mind as we go. We're going to be scratching the surface today. So first, what even is the Consolidate Records module? Well, in its most basic definition, Consolidate Records is Slate's deduping hub. It is absolutely essential to use, and it's really the area where, after Slate is doing some work behind the scenes, it passes the baton to us as a human to say, all right, take over from here. Now, there is quite a bit of information on this module in the knowledge base. What's essential to take away from the technical aspect is that every night, or really every early morning, Slate is doing work behind the scenes in your production environment to try to find and remove duplicate data that is happening between 2 and 4 a.m. Eastern typically. But that's enough of the technical piece for now. It's really not our focus for today. Once again, really just scratching the surface, providing the basic foundation today. So do keep that in mind. But I'd actually really like to start with the reason I wanted to create this demo video is a horror story. Is actually a couple of years ago, I was working with a school that came to me with the problem of having a ton of duplicate data, records and other data. And when we did a little bit of digging, we found not only had they not used, but they hadn't heard of the Consolidate Records module. And they had over 100,000 pairs of matching records. It took them months. It was monumental of a task to overcome. So what I have found is, unfortunately, it's more common of a story than you might realize. I have encountered schools since of a similar situation. So let's dive in. Enough with the backstory. Let's actually head on over into Slate. Believe it or not, we actually start this conversation in the forms module. And if you are a form builder, or maybe not, is you know some things are defaulted in the forms module. For example, the person scope, but also some fields. These are the fields that would come in automatically when you are building a form. And what's important to note for our session today is that Slate and Technolutions have 4 criteria that they recommend you keep as that sort of minimum for Slate to do its job. And those are here: email address, first name, last name, and birth date. You should absolutely be keeping those in some capacity and using that in your forms and in your Slate environment. More on this in a bit, but just setting that foundation that these are those minimum criteria. All right, let's head to the module. It does live in the database. Not everyone on your team may be able to access it because of that, and not everyone needs to. I will say a couple times today that usually a small group of people should be in charge of this module. But here it is, named Consolidate Records. And the module itself is pretty easy to navigate. One of my favorite ironies in Slate is that we have a left column and a right column here, and they actually really do the same thing. It's the same set of actions. So of course, in a module about deduping, we have some repetition. So don't worry, you can do either of these things on the left or the right. In a perfect world, you would have someone or a couple people coming in here once a day, and in each section, selecting this refresh button. That is going to trigger Slate to go look for possible pairs of records since it last ran. There's a lot you could do on this page, and for time today, we're really just going to look at one example that I love for trainings. It's pretty approachable, and that's the one here for email under person. What this is essentially saying is Slate has identified 182 pairs of people with the same email address. This is the part where it wants a human to take over, i.e., select this option. And again, I'm using email today, but any of these hyperlinks will be essentially the same process. You click it, and it's going to provide you line items that represent pairs of records. Now, this is a pretty consequential module. You may have gathered that already. I'm not going to read this verbatim, but key takeaways in the first line. Exercise caution when merging records. Slate is live, transactional, it's active, so it's hard to unmerge if you make a mistake. And more on that in a little bit. Essential functionality. Every one of these rows, again, represents a pair of records that has a compare button. And that is Slate nudging us to say, all right, each of these rows, select that compare option and make a judgment call. Now, I always like to use Nick Conti's records here because I am also named Nick and we're talking about deduping today. So let's have some fun. I'm going to go into Nick's compare row here. And this will essentially be your process each time. There's nothing that really changes or is different. We're just using one example for today. But the essential layout and interface of this dialog window is that we get a main record on the left, we get a duplicate record on the right. Slate is making a judgment call behind the scenes using a variety of guiding principles. We're not going to get into how Slate determines which is the main and which is the duplicate, but a key takeaway is that it might not always be the way that you want it. If that's the case, you have this little tiny set of arrow buttons that flips the main record and duplicate. That is not the consolidate part. That is just helping you figure out which record will persist. And as you might gather, the main record is the one that is going to persist. We could spend a lot of time here talking about all of the data nuances, but I, again, want to give the 101 approach here. I won't bury the lead. I would come in here and pretty quickly ascertain that these two records really should be merged. If I am even in a second able to gather that, I can select the merge button at any point, click OK, and then those two records become one. The main record persists more generally, and it absorbs more generally the duplicate record data. And more on that in a moment for some of those nuances. However, I also have a button here called exclude. I would not use that here, but if I determined that these really were two different people, I could select exclude, and what that would do is tell Slate, hey, I don't need you to compare these tomorrow morning or any morning thereafter. I have indicated purposely and intentionally that these are different people. Do not bring them here again. So a little bit deeper now into this. How would we actually make this judgment call? Well, in Slate, there's a lot of ways we can store data. For example, data can exist more than once, like this address section here in red. Someone can have more than one address. So that's something we can use in our decision-making process. There's also data points that an individual can only have once. For example, a birth date. A human being can only have one birth date. And then there's data that probably can only exist once. I know someone might be a set of twins sharing an email, or maybe a parent is using or accidentally input their child's email or vice versa. So again, there's different ways data are stored. But in general, items that are in red, Slate is telling us are different. Items in yellow, they're the same. And if something isn't highlighted, it means that one or another of the columns just has the absence of data. Would come in here and say, all right, a person can have more than one address. So that helps me make this judgment call. But then I would look at some of these data columns that are the same. And I would say, well, this pair of records share an email address. They share a birth date, and they share a first and a last name. This goes back to our forms conversation here. That gives me quite a bit of information. And I would probably at that point, again, say, these are the same person. Let's merge these two records into one. A little bit of backdrop on what happens to the data, because some data will persist and some won't. In the case of our mailing address here, once again, a mailing address can exist more than once. Someone can live in Pittsburgh but have an address in Greenville. That data will come over and we'll sort of combine it. We will maintain this Pittsburgh address as the higher ranked address, but the Greenville address will come over. It will just get a lower ranking. There's other ways that Slate stores data, though. For example, status. We don't have to really think about that here because both of these records have a prospect status. But in an example where someone is an inquiry and someone is a prospect, there are some rules behind the scenes that on how Slate is using these. And so, for example, in this case, the inquiry is actually going to be the status that persists. We'll have no reference in the new merged record to this prospect status. So just keep in mind that there are some things that will come over and some data will persist, some won't. That's where I would guide you to the knowledge base. There are 11 articles in the knowledge base on Consolidate Records, and it really gets into single value fields, multi-value fields, data that persist or not. Key takeaways. There's different ways data behave, but the main idea here is that you have a main record. This is the one that if you merge them would persist, and data will either come over and it will be added to the record, or data will override if it's different. I promised you a brief overview. That is the brief overview. There's a lot more we could cover, but really the key takeaway is you should be coming in here. Someone should be coming in here, clicking refresh, going into each one of those different sections, and then select and compare on these pairs of records in order to figure out, is this the same person? If so, we're going to merge it. Or are these two different people we're going to exclude? Let's head back here to just wrap up with some best practices. A summary of them, in fact, and where to take this from here if you're yearning for a little more information, knowing again that at Carnegie, we often do 60 or 90-minute trainings on this topic. I haven't mentioned, but I love this tool. In the age of AI, it's pretty emblematic that there's still a need for human touch. So, key takeaways. Take the advice from Technolutions. You should be collecting first name, last name, email, and birth date on your forms or elsewhere in order for Slate to do its job. Now, I will say there are some creative ways to hide that information. For example, on an app scoped form, you could pre-populate that information and make it read-only or hide it. So there are considerations there for a better user experience, but in general, collect those 4 data points in order to help Slate do its job. One that is absolutely critical, you should be dedicating a staff member or two to look at this tool daily. Make it part of someone's job description. It can be a habit. Every morning someone goes in and looks at this. And if you can't devote those resources to daily, at a minimum, you should be looking weekly, maybe every Monday, every Friday, look at this data, but ideally daily. You should be methodical in this work. Use all available information for merging. I did not show you, but there is an unmerge button. You should avoid using it. It's physically easy to use. It's just a button with a warning, obviously. But in general, Slate is that live transactional database. And if you wait even a few hours or days, those records that you merged become increasingly challenging to unmerge and keep the data clean. For example, someone might have dropped in or out of a deliver campaign in the time after you merge the records. If you're sitting here saying, oh my goodness, didn't really know about this tool and no one on my team is using it, our number is huge. Unfortunately, you're not alone. I will say, start now. It's never too late to get started and chip away at it if your number is quite large. I mentioned a few times, I'll say it again here in our closing, recognize that today's session really was about covering the basics and essentials. I would encourage you, go to the knowledge base to uncover the technical aspects, all of the data nuances and how data merge and the behaviors of multi-value versus single value data. There's far more than we can uncover in a short video session today. A bonus, one of those 11 articles is sort of an enhancement opportunity. You can create a custom dashboard in the Consolidate Records tool. It would allow you to compare additional data points beyond Slate's defaults. That article is very aptly named. It's just called Consolidate Records Custom Dashboard. So that's it for today. I would encourage, I'm happy to take questions if you have them. You can always reach out about this or a variety of other topics. My name is Nick Porcella, and well, looks like I have some deduping to do.